The Melbourne Tramway network is a major form of public transport in Melbourne, the capital city of the state of Victoria, Australia. As of May 2014, the network consisted of 250 kilometres of track, 493 trams, 25 routes, and 1,763 tram stops. It is the largest urban tramway network in the world, ahead of the networks in St Petersburg, Berlin, Moscow and Vienna. Trams are the second most used form of public transport in overall boardings in Melbourne after the commuter railway network, with a total of 182.7 million passenger trips in 2012/13. Trams have operated continuously in Melbourne since 1884, with the opening of a horse tram line in Fairfield. Since then they have become a distinctive part of Melbourne's character and feature in tourism and travel advertising. Melbourne's cable tram system opened in 1885, and expanded to one of the largest in the world, with 75 kilometres of double track. The first electric tram line opened in 1889, but closed only a few years later in 1894. In 1906 electric tram systems were opened in St Kilda and Essendon, marking the start of continuous operation of Melbourne's electric trams. The Melbourne and Metropolitan Tramways Board was formed in 1919 to take control of Melbourne's cable tram network, 6 of the 7 electric tramway companies, and the last horse tram. By 1940 all cable and horse tram lines had been abandoned or converted to either electric tram or bus operation. Victoria's public transport system was reorganised in 1983 and saw the Melbourne and Metropolitan Tramways Board dissolved into the Metropolitan Transit Authority, which was in turn absorbed by the Public Transport Corporation in 1989. The network has been operated under contract since the commencement of franchising, following the privatisation of the Public Transport Corporation in 1999. The current private operator contracted to run Melbourne's tram system is Keolis Downer, trading as Yarra Trams. Ticketing, public information and patronage promotion are undertaken by Victoria's public transport body, Public Transport Victoria. The multimodal integrated ticketing system, MyKey, currently operates across the tram network. At some Melbourne intersections, motor vehicles are required to perform a hook turn, a manoeuvre designed to give trams priority. To further improve tram speeds on congested Melbourne streets, trams also have priority in road usage, with specially fitted traffic lights and exclusive lanes being provided either at all times or in peak times, as well as other measures. From January 1, 2015 riding trams inside the central business district is free. History Horse trams Melbourne's first tram was a horse tram from Fairfield railway station to a real estate development in Thornbury. It opened on December 20, 1884, and was closed by 1890. 7 horse trams operated in Melbourne, 3 lines were built by the Melbourne Tramway and Omnibus Company, while the other 4 were built by different private companies. The MTOC's 3 lines fed their cable tram system. Victoria Bridge Cable Tram Terminus to Kew, opened in 1887 and closed in 1915 after its sale to Kew Council for conversion to a Prahran and Malvern Tramways Trust electric line. Hawthorn Bridge Cable Tram Terminus to Auburn Road, via Burwood Road, Power Street and Riversdale Road, opened in 1890 and closed on January 31, 1916 after being sold to the Hawthorn Tramways Trust for conversion to electric traction. And the Zoo Line, from the Royal Parade Cable Line to Melbourne Zoological Gardens, opened on March 10, 1890 and closed in November 1923. The Zoo Line was Melbourne's last horse tram and the only line still in operation at the formation of the Melbourne and Metropolitan Tramways Board. It was destroyed by fire during the 1923 police strike. The MMTB took the decision not to reopen it, ending Melbourne's horse tram era. Cable trams Melbourne's cable tram system has its origins in the MTOC, started by Francis Boardman Clapp in 1877, with a view to operate a Melbourne tram system. After some initial resistance, he successfully lobbied the government who passed the Melbourne Tramway and Omnibus Company Act 1883 on October 10, 1883, granting the company the right to operate a cable tram system in Melbourne. Although some lines were originally intended to be horse trams, and the MTOC did operate 3 horse tram lines on the edges of the system, the core of the system was built as cable trams. The Act established the Melbourne Tramways Trust, which was made up of the 12 municipalities that the MTOC system would serve. The MTT was responsible for the construction of tracks and engine house, while the MTOC built the depots, offices and arranged for the delivery or construction of the rolling stock. The MTT granted a lease to operate the system until July 1, 1916 to the MTOC, with the MTOC paying 4.5% interest on the debts incurred by the MTT in building the system. The first cable tram line opened on November 11, 1885, running from Book Street to Hawthorne Bridge, along Spencer Street, Flinders Street, Wellington Parade and Bridge Road, with the last line opening on October 27, 1891. At its height the cable system was one of the largest in the world, with 75 kilometres of double track, 1,200 grips and trailers and 17 routes covering. On February 18, 1890, the Northcote Tramway was opened by the Clifton Hill to Northcote and Preston Tramway Company. This was Melbourne's only non-MTOC cable tram, built by local land speculators and was operated as an independent line, feeding the Clifton Hill line. When the lease expired on July 1, 1916, all the assets of the MTT and MTOC cable network were taken over by the Melbourne Tramways Board. The MMTB was formed on November 1, 1919, taking over the MTB cable tram network, with the Northcote Tramway and the Tramway Trusts transferred to the MMTB on February 20, 1920. From 1924 the cable tram lines were progressively converted to electric trams, or abandoned in favour of buses, with the last Melbourne cable tram operating on October 26, 1940. First electric trams equals. The first electric tram in Melbourne was built in 1889 by the Box Hill and Doncaster Tramway Company Limited, an enterprise formed by a group of land developers, and ran from Box Hill railway station along what is now Station Street and Tram Road to Doncaster, using equipment left over from the Centennial International Exhibition of 1888 at the Royal Exhibition Building. The venture was marred with disputes and operational problems, and ultimately failed, with the service ceasing in 1896. After this venture failed, electric trams returned on May 5, 1906, with the opening of the Victorian Railway's Electric Street Railway from St Kilda to Brighton, and was followed on October 11, 1906 with the opening of the North Melbourne Electric Tramway and Lighting Company system, which opened 2 lines from the cable tram terminus at Flemington Bridge to Essendon and Saltwater River. Victorian Railways Electric Street Railways. The Victorian Railways line came about when Sir Thomas Bent became Premier of the state. A corrupt politician and leading land boomer, he stood to benefit from construction of the line, through the increased value of his large land holdings in the area, and pushed through the legislation to enable the building of the line by the VR in 1904. The VR tram was called a street railway, and was built using the Victorian Railway's 1,600 mm broad gauge instead of the cable tramway standard gauge of 1,435 mm, and connected it with the St Kilda railway station, to allow trams to be moved along the St Kilda railway line for servicing at Jolimont Yard. The line was opened in 2 stages, from St Kilda railway station to Middle Brighton on May 5, 1906 and to Brighton Beach Terminus on December 22, 1906. A fire at the Elwood Tram Depot on March 7, 1907 destroyed the depot and all the trams. Services resumed on March 17, 1907 using 4 C-Class trams and 3 D-Class trams from Sydney, which were altered to run on VR trucks salvaged from the fire. These trams sufficed until Newport Railway Workshops built 14 new trams. The St Kilda to Brighton Beach Electric Street Railway closed on February 28, 1959 and was replaced by buses. VR opened a second, standard gauge, electric tramway from Sandringham Railway Station to Black Rock on March 10, 1919, it was extended to Beaumaris on September 2, 1926. The service was withdrawn on November 5, 1956 and replaced with buses. North Melbourne Electric Tramway and Lighting Company. The NMELT was an electricity and tramway company that operated from 1906 to 1922. The tramway section was taken over by the MMTB on August 1, 1922, and the electricity section taken over by the State Electricity Commission of Victoria in 1922. The Victorian government of Sir Thomas Bent approved an application by Mr Morgan to build a tramway system in the Essendon area on March 29, 1904, with a poll of ratepayers overwhelming supporting the proposition on July 29, 1904. Mr Morgan transferred the concession to the NMELT, which had been formed to build the system and provide electricity to the area. Under the concession, the NMELT was to construct a tramway and provide electricity within the municipalities of Essendon and Flemington for 30 years. It also mandated a service at least every 20 minutes and had provisions for the undertaking to become property of the municipalities involved earlier than the prescribed 30 years. The NMELT bought land on Mount Alexander Road for its offices, car barn and powerhouse, with the foundation stone laid by the mayors of Essendon and Flemington on May 24, 1905, and the first rail laid a month later by Premier Bent. The system opened on October 11, 1906, operating 2 routes from Flemington Bridge Euro 1 to Essendon via Mount Alexander Road, Pascoe Vale Road, Fletcher Street and on to Mount Alexander Road again, and the second to Saltwater River via Mount Alexander Road, Victoria Street, Racecourse Road, Epsom Road, Union Road and Maribyrnong Road. The system was approximately 7 miles and was operated by 25 motor cars and 10 trailers. The Tramway Trusts due to demand for better public transport in Melbourne's inner suburbs of Prahran and Malvern. The Prahran and Malvern Tramways Trust Act 1907 was enacted. Councillor Alex Cameron of Malvern, who led the push for a municipal tramway service, was elected chairman of the trust by both Malvern and Prahran councils. Construction began on its first tram line in 1909 with the first passenger service commencing in May 30, 1910. Using overhead wires to feed electricity to the trams, this network continued to expand so greatly and profitably that when the MMTB was established in July 1919, Alex Cameron was appointed its full-time chairman. Network under MMTB. Alex Cameron, chairman of the MMTB, was in charge of a tramway network that had both cable and electric traction and had been constructed by different bodies without any uniform system. Under Cameron's guidance, the Tramways Board was to bring these under a single control, extend the electric lines, and convert the existing cable system to electric traction. To solve operational and maintenance problem, the MMTB introduced in 1923 the iconic W-Class Tram and phased out the other models. The Preston workshops were constructed about this time to manufacture and maintain the new tram fleet. In March 1923, Alex Cameron went overseas to investigate traffic problems. He returned next year confirmed in his long-held opinions that electric trams were superior to buses and that overhead wires were preferable to the underground conduit system. Alex Cameron remained chairman there until 1935. He died a few years later in 1940, the same year the last of the cable tram services in Melbourne ended. The MMTB generated further patronage by developing the enormous Wattle Park in the 1920s and 1930s. It had inherited Wattle Park from the Hawthorn Tramways Trust with the HTT's takeover by the MMTB. After World War II, other Australian cities began to replace their trams with buses. However, in Melbourne, the Book Street buses were replaced by trams in 1955, and new lines opened to East Preston and East Brunswick. Melbourne's tram usage peaked at 260 million trips in 1949, before dropping sharply to 200 million the following year in 1950. However, usage defied the trend and bounced back in 1951, but began a gradual decline in usage which would continue until 1970. During the same period, bus use also went into decline, and buses have never proved as popular with passengers as trams at any time in Melbourne's history. By the 1970s, Melbourne was the only Australian city with a major tram network. Melbourne resisted the trend to shut down the network for 3 major reasons, partly because the city's wide streets and geometric street pattern made trams more practicable than in many other cities. partly because of resistance from the unions, and partly because the chairman of the MMTB, Sir Robert Wilson, successfully argued that the cost of ripping up the concrete-embedded tram tracks would be prohibitive. Also, the infrastructure and vehicles were relatively new, having replaced cable tram equipment in only the 1920s or 1940s. This destroyed the argument used by many other cities, which was that renewal of the tram system would cost more than replacing it with buses. By the mid-1970s, as other cities became increasingly choked in traffic and air pollution, Melbourne was convinced that its decision to retain its trams was the correct one, even though patronage had been declining since the 1950s in the face of increasing use of cars and the shift to the outer suburbs, beyond the tram network's limits. The first tram line extension in over 20 years took place in 1978, along Burwood Highway. The W-Class trams were gradually replaced by the new Z-Class trams in the 1970s, and by the A-Class trams and the larger, articulated B-Class trams in the 1980s. In 1980, the controversial Loney Report recommended the closure of 7 tram lines. Public protests and union action resulted these closures not being carried out. Metropolitan Transit Authority and Public Transport Corporation equals. The MMTB, along with the Metropolitan Railway assets of VicRail, were absorbed into the newly formed Metropolitan Transit Authority on July 1, 1983, while the regional assets of VicRail were absorbed by the State Transit Authority. The MTA was formed to coordinate and operate the Melbourne public transport system. During 1986 €87 in integration of rail, tram and bus divisions took place, with the operations, maintenance and administration of these departments fully integrated by April 11, 1988. The MTA introduced a new green and yellow livery and uniform design, with a new logo, showing the integration of Melbourne's public transport system, replacing the MMTB logo, and introduced a new time-based integrated ticketing system, for all modes of Melbourne's public transport. An automatic vehicle monitoring system was introduced in 1985, improving communication with drivers and allowing tracking of trams throughout the network. This reduced tram bunching and improved reliability of tram services. The St Kilda and Port Melbourne railway lines were converted to light rail lines in 1987, with the lines closed on 1 July 1987 and 11 October 1987 respectively. Trams first ran on the St Kilda line on November 20, 1987, with Port Melbourne following on December 13, 1987. The conversion consisted of the track being regauged from broad gauge 1,600 mm to standard gauge 1,435 mm, the overhead being converted to tramway voltage and light rail platforms built adjacent to the former station's platforms. As a result of the Transport Act 1989, the MTA and STA were merged into the Public Transport Corporation on July 1, 1989, bringing all rail services in Victoria under one body. By the late 1980s, the state government was under financial pressures brought on by an economic downturn. In January 1990, the Labour government of Premier John Cain tried to introduce economies into the running of the public transport system, including the removal of tram conductors. This provoked a long and crippling strike by the Tramways union in January 1990, resulting in a backdown by the government and the retention of conductors. In the 1992 state election, the Liberals came to power under Premier Jeff Kennett, who planned to cut the costs of Melbourne's public transport network and remove conductors. One link were contracted in 1995 to introduce an automatic ticketing system. The Tramway Union, which opposed this move, went on strike during the 1997 Grand Prix. 1 month later, the government announced plans for privatisation of the PTC. The tram conductors were replaced with ticketing machines between 1996 and 1998 shortly before the system was privatised. This move led to the loss of millions of dollars in revenue through fare evasion. Privatisation. On July 1, 1997, in preparation for privatisation of the Public Transport Corporation, Melbourne's tram network was split into 2 businesses, Metram 1 and Metram 2. VicTrack, a new statutory authority within the Victorian government, was created in 1997 to hold the ownership of land and assets relating to Victoria's tram and rail systems. In addition, a statutory office was established the Director of Public Transport to procure rail and tram services and to enter into and manage contracts with transport operators. After a tendering process, the businesses were awarded as 12-year franchises, with St Trams won by National Express Group, and the Yarra Trams business by Transdev TSL. Following a transitional period, the right to operate the two tram businesses was officially transferred from the government to the private sector under franchise agreements on August 29, 1999. National Express renamed St Trams as Tram, similarly along with its Train suburban train business, on October 1, 2001. After several years of failing to make a profit, more than a year of negotiations over revised financing arrangements with the government, and grave concern over its future viability, National Express Group announced on December 16, 2002, its decision to walk away from all of their Victorian contracts and hand control back to the state government, with funding for its operations to stop on December 23, 2002. The government ran Tram until negotiations were completed with Yarra Trams for it to take over responsibility of the whole tram network from April 18, 2004. On June 25, 2009, it was announced that Keolis Downer a joint venture between Keolis and Downer a would be the operator of the Melbourne tram network from November 30, 2009. The contract is for 8 years with an option for a further 7 years. As a part of the privatisation process, franchise contracts between the state government and both private operators included obligations to extend and modernise the Melbourne tram network. This included acquiring new tram rolling stock. In addition, the existing tram fleet was refurbished. St Trams introduced 59 new Combino low-floor built trams by Siemens, at a cost of $175 million, and invested approximately $8 million in refurbishing their fleet, while Yarra Trams introduced 36 Citadis low-floor trams from Alstom, at a cost of $100 million, and invested $5.3 million refurbishing their fleet. In 2003, the marketing and umbrella brand Midlink was introduced to coordinate the promotion of Melbourne's public transport and the communications from the separate privatised companies. Midlink's role was to provide timetables, passenger information about connecting services provided by several operators, fares and ticketing information, and introduce uniform signage across the Melbourne public transport system. Since privatisation, extensions have been made to the tram system, with the $28 million extension of the 109 to Box Hill opening on May 2, 2003, a $7.5 million extension along Docklands Drive in Docklands opened on January 4, 2005, and a $42.6 million extension of the 75 to Vermont South opening on July 23, 2005. It was announced on September 27, 2010 that Bombardier Transportation had won a $303 million contract to supply and maintain 50 new E-Class trams. The contract includes an option for a further 100. They will be built at Bombardier's Dandenong factory, with the propulsion systems and bogies coming from Bombardier's factories in Mannheim and Siegen, Germany, respectively. The trams will be 33 meters long and have a capacity of 210 passengers and are due to be in service in 2013. The first E-Class tram arrived at Preston workshops in late June 2013 for testing, with the first two E-Class entering revenue service in November 2013. In April 2012, Public Transport Victoria, a new statutory authority, was formed after amendments to the Transport Integration Act and the passing of the Transport Legislation Amendment Act 2011. PTV assumed responsibility from the Director of Public Transport for the provision and administration of Victoria's transport services. It also provides information on fares, transport services and initiatives, and is responsible for overseeing and improving Victoria's public transport services. The era since privatisation has also brought large patronage increases, an increase in platform stops, and a new ticketing system. In 1999 Euro 2000 Euro, when the trams system was privatised Euro patronage was €127.3 million per annum. This has increased almost each year since, and in the 2012 Euro 2013 year was 182.7 million passenger trips, a 4.2% year-on-year patronage increase. Trams are the second most utilised public transport method, between trains and buses. Yarra Trams, the Department of Transport, and later Public Transport Victoria, are introducing level boarding stops to improve accessibility and safety, and comply with the Disability Discrimination Act. As of January 2014 360 accessible stops have been constructed, all since 1999. The Metcard ticketing system which operated from 1996 was switched off on December 29, 2012, leaving Mikia Euro, which has been in operation on Melbourne trains since December 29, 2009, and valid on Melbourne trams and buses since July 25, 2010. Euro as the sole ticketing system. Routes. Melbourne's tram system comprises 25 regular revenue routes and the Free City Circle service, although there are a number of irregular routes and special services. From August 28, 2011, irregular route numbers started changing, aiming to simplify the numbering system, thus avoiding passenger confusion. Under these changes, route numbers suffixed with an A run an altered service, while route numbers suffixed with AD terminate at depots. From January 1, 2016 6 tram routes will run all night on weekends as Night Network's night tram component. Fleet. The Melbourne tram fleet currently comprises 501 trams as of November 2014. Classification is based on the original system begun by the MMTB in 1921. All the rolling stock is leased to Yarra Trams, with the W, Z, A and B class trams owned by the Victorian government, and the C class and D classes are subject to lease purchase agreements, while the C2 class trams were leased from Mulhouse, France but are now state assets. W class trams equals 752 trams built in total 1923 Euro 1956, in service 1923 Euro present. 230 total currently, 165 in storage, 27 stored operational in ready reserve, 26 in revenue service, 12 operated on the City Circle. W-class trams were introduced to Melbourne in 1923 as a new standard design. They had a dual bogie layout with a distinctive drop centre section, allowing the centrally placed doors to be closer to the ground. They are a simple rugged design, with a substantially timber frame, supplanted by a steel underframe, characterised by fine craftsmanship. The W-class was the mainstay of Melbourne's tramway system for 60 years. A total of 752 trams of 12 variants were built, the last in 1956. It was not until the 1980s that the W-class started to be replaced in large numbers, and by 1990 their status as an icon for the city was recognised, leading to a listing by the National Trust. Public outrage over their sale for tourist use overseas led to an embargo on further export out of the country in 1993, though recently some have been given or loaned to various museums. Approximately 200 of the W-class trams retired since then remain stored, and the future use of these trams is unknown. W-class trams have been sent overseas. 5 went to Seattle between 1978 and 1993, where they operated on Seattle's George Benson Waterfront streetcar line, starting in 1982 but suspended in 2005. Another 9 are now part of the downtown Memphis tourist service, while several other U.S. cities have 1 or 2. As of January 2015, there are about 230 W-class trams, about 165 are in storage. 27 are stored operational in ready reserve, 12 run on the City's Circle and 26 are used in revenue service. In January 2010, it was announced by the new Transport Minister that the 26 W-class trams running the 2 inner-city routes would be phased out by 2012, prompting a new campaign from the National Trust of Australia. In 2010 it was proposed to better utilise the unused W-class trams by refurbishing and leasing them as roving ambassadors to other cities, generating revenue which could then be invested back into the public transport system. In 2011 the Victoria government committed $8 million over 4 years for the restoration of W-Class trams, with options for new routes currently being considered. Z-Class trams equals Z1 a Euro 100 built, made in Australia, 26 currently in service, Z2 a Euro 15 built, made in Australia, 2 currently in service, Z3 a Euro 115 built, made in Australia, 113 currently in service. The development of new rolling stock to replace the W-Class finally began in the early 1970s with a modern design, based on the Gothenburg, Sweden M28 design. The Z-Class trams, built by Koman, were introduced from 1975, starting with the Z1 class. Built from 1975 to 1979 100 trams were built. They had conductors' consoles that passengers would have to queue for, and only 2 doors. These 2 features hampered loading, and proved unpopular. Most of Z1 class were withdrawn following the introduction of the C and D class trams, leaving 30 in service. This number in service as of March 2015 and 26. Those withdrawn were usually sold at auction, with some being donated to tram museums. In 1978 and 1979, 15 Z2 class trams, having little difference from the Z1 class were built. As with the Z1 class, many Z2 class trams have been withdrawn from service, with 2 remaining in service. From 1979 to 1984, Z3 class trams were introduced, being a significant improvement on the Z1 and Z2 class trams. They had an additional door each side, removed the conductor's console and much smoother acceleration and braking. 115 were built, 113 of which are in service. All are re-liveried in either Yarra trams or all-over advertising livery. A-class trams equals A1 a Euro 28 built, made in Australia, 27 still in service, A2 a Euro 42 built, made in Australia, all still in service. The A-class trams were built between 1984 and 1986 by Koman. They were built as 2 runs, the A1 class being introduced into service between 1984 and 1985, and A2 class between 1985 and 1986. They were very similar, the major difference being the brakes, and that the A1 class were built with trolley poles, while A2 class were built with pantographs. All 70 that were built are still in service today. Though A1.231 is currently stored due to fire damage. B-class trams equals B1 a Euro 2 built, made in Australia, both still in service, B2 a Euro 130 built, made in Australia, 129 in service, air-conditioned. The B-class trams were first introduced to Melbourne in 1984 with the first prototype B1 class trams, the second being built in 1985, both remain in service today. The B-class trams used the same traction equipment as the Z3 and A-class trams, and were built for the light rail lines. They were originally built with movable steps to allow railway platform and street-level boarding, but this concept was later abandoned, with low-floor platform built at the converted light rail stations. B2 class trams entered service from 1988 to Euro 1994, by Koman, and later ABB Transportation, with 130 built, all but one of which remain in service today. The B2 class was the first Melbourne tram fitted with air conditioning. All of the B-class trams are either in Yarra Trams livery or covered with all-over advertising. C-class trams equals C1 a Euro 36 in service, made in France, C2 a Euro 5 in service, made in France. Bumblebees. Following the privatisation of Melbourne's tram system, the private operators acquired new trams to replace the older Z-class trams. In 2001 Yarra Trams introduced the Citadines or C-class trams, manufactured in France by Alstom. They are 3-section articulated vehicles, with 36 in service. 5 low-floor C2 class trams were introduced in 2008 after being leased from Mulhouse in France. They have been dubbed Bumblebees due to their distinctive yellow color, and exclusively run on Route 96. It was announced in November 2010 that the state government was in negotiations to purchase the 5 C2 trams, with the purchase finalized by 2013. The C-Class trams are owned by Allco entity and are subject to a lease purchase agreement. While the C2 class trams were leased from Socia Copyright TAR Copyright GAR Copyright NAR Copyright Rail entity, but were subsequently purchased by the Victorian government in the 2012 Euro 2013 year. D-Class trams equals D1 a Euro 38 in service, made in Germany, D2 a Euro 21 in service, made in Germany. Following the privatization of Melbourne's tram system, the private operators acquired new trams to replace the older Z-Class trams. The German-made Siemens Combino trams were introduced by the now-defunct Tram operations were transferred to Yarra Trams in 2004 following negotiations with the state government after National Express walked away from its contract to operate Tram in 2002. The Combino is a 3-section or 5-section articulated vehicle. Currently 38 D1 class and 21 D2 class trams are in service. The D1 class and D2 class trams are owned by CBA entity and are subject to a lease purchase agreement. E-class trams equals EA Euro 32 in service out of an order of 50, made in Australia. The E-class are 3-section, 4-bogie articulated trams built by Bombardier Transportation in their Dandenong factory, with the propulsion systems and bogies coming from Bombardier's Mannheim and Siegen factories in Germany. Bombardier was selected on September 27, 2010 following a tendering process for 50 new low-floor trams, which was opened in 2009. The $303 million contract is for supply of 50 trams with maintenance to 2017, and includes an option for a further 100 trams. The trams are based upon the Flexity Swift design, and are being built at Bombardier's Dandenong factory. They are the first locally built Melbourne trams since the B-Class in 1994. They are 33 metres long, 2.65 metres wide, low floor with anti-slip flooring, air-conditioned, have automatic audio-visual announcements and a passenger capacity of 210. A 2/3 mock-up, produced for design input, was unveiled on August 24, 2011 and was displayed at the 2011 Royal Melbourne Show. Although originally anticipated to be delivered in 2012, design complexity slowed down construction, delaying delivery of the first tram. The first E-Class tram arrived at Yarra Trams Preston workshops on June 28. By September 2013 there were 2 E-Class trams at Preston workshops undergoing non-passenger testing in preparation for introduction to service in late 2013. The first 2 trams entered service on November 4, 2013, and were joined by a further 3 by the start of 2014. As at the 27th of August 2015, 27 were in service and 1 under testing and commissioning. Depots: Melbourne's trams run out of 8 depots. Power supply: Melbourne's tram system operates on 600-volt DC electricity, provided to the overhead lines by a network of 50 substations spread across the network. Electricity is supplied to these substations in either 6,600, 11,000, or 22,000-volt AC and is then stepped down, and rectified to 600-volt DC. The overhead system is further separated into 100 sections. This is done for 2 reasons: 1 is to maintain voltage and current across the network, and 2 is to isolate disruptions when issues relating to the electrical transmission system occur. The most common disturbances to the supply system are overheight vehicles, falling tree limbs, damaged poles, and fires nearby to overhead wires. Since 2013 Yarra Trams have been provisioning for the upgrade of substations across the network. This is due to the increased amount of current required by newer trams such as the E-Class and other low-floor trams scheduled for wider deployment across the system. Additionally, they are concurrently planning for the further segmentation of the supply network, further isolating disruptions caused by disturbance to the supply system. Tram or Euro train level crossings. There are currently 4 level crossings where trams and trains cross each other: Burke Road, Gardner, Glenferrie Road, Cong, Glen Huntly Road, Glen Huntly, and Riversdale Road, Camberwell. To accommodate the differing voltages of the 600-volt tram and 1500-volt train systems, each of these level crossings is fitted with an overhead square, which can isolate the section of overhead wiring above the crossing and apply the appropriate voltage. When the signal box adjacent to the crossing interlocks the gates for trains to pass through, 1500 volts is applied, while when the gates are up 600 volts is applied. Historically, many tram or Euro-train level crossings have operated in Melbourne, all but the aforementioned 4 have been grade separated, or the tramway or railway has been abandoned. The first were built during the cable tram system's operation, with much reluctance on behalf of the Victorian railways. Many more were built after the emergence of electric trams in 1906, often causing disputes between tramway operators and the Victorian railways. Popular culture. Melbourne's trams are Euro, especially the W-Class Euro, are an icon of Melbourne and important part of its history and character. Trams have been featured across several media, and in tourism advertising since World War II. Trams are heavily featured in the movie Malcolm, one scene of the controversial film Alvin Purple, and feature in the video clips for the Beastie Boys' The Rat Cage, and AC/DC's It's a Long Way to the Top. Among songs written about Melbourne's trams are Chorek Tram by Bernard Bolan, Taking the Tram to Carnegie by Oscar, and many songs including Man on a Tram, and Northcote by the Bedroom Philosopher from the ARIA-nominated album Songs from the '86 Tram. The Eastern Suburbs Professional Community Theatre Company, known as Theatre Works, staged a performance on a 109 tram entitled Storming Mont Albert by Tram, between February 26 and March 14, 1982, as part of the Melbourne Moomba Festival. It was written by Paul Davis and directed by Mark Sheriffs and was revived in 1992 and 1998. For the Melbourne 2006 Commonwealth Games, a Z-Class tram was decorated as a Karachi bus by a team of Pakistani decorators. Dubbed the Karachi Tram, it operated on the city's Circle tourist route during the Commonwealth Games. The centerpiece of the opening ceremony was a flying W-Class tram, specially built for the event, from original W-Class plans and photos. On October 26, 2011, a Z3 Class tram, specially liveried as a royal tram, was used to convey Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, from Federation Square to Government House, along St Kilda Road during their visit to Melbourne. The royal tram was in regular service for a little over 1 year following the event. From 1978 to 1993, 36 W-Class trams were painted with artwork as part of the Transporting Art project. The idea was conceived in early 1978 by Melbourne Lord Mayor Irvin Rockman and artist Clifton Pugh. The idea was backed by then Premier Rupert Hammer, and over the time of the project many notable artists participated. The idea was reprised as part of the Melbourne Festival in 2013, with a competition launched in May 2013 to select 8 designs, one to operate out of each Melbourne tram depot. The first of the new Melbourne Art trams, W-Class 925, was launched on September 30, 2013 by then Premier Dennis Napthine and Yarra Trams CEO Claire Copyright Ment Michelle, with the remaining 7 trams to be introduced in the following 2 weeks. The last was introduced to service on October 11, 2013. Legislation and governance. Transport Integration Act equals. The prime rail-related statute in Victoria is the Transport Integration Act. The Act was enacted to provide an overarching legislation for Victoria's transport system. It requires state agencies charged with providing transport services to work together towards an integrated transport system, and requires state planning bodies to consult the Act when making decisions that will affect the transport system. The Act establishes Transport Safety Victoria as Victoria's safety regulator for bus, maritime and rail transport. The Act also establishes the independent office of the Director, Transport Safety, though the regulatory function is carried out with the support of TSV. Another important piece of legislation is the Rail Management Act 1996, whose purpose is to establish a management regime for Victoria's rail infrastructure. Safety. The safety of tram operations in Melbourne is regulated by the Rail Safety Act 2006, which applies to all rail operations in Victoria. The Act establishes a framework containing safety duties for all rail industry participants and requires operators who manage infrastructure and rolling stock to obtain accreditation prior to commencing operations. Accredited operators are also required to have a safety management system to guide their operations. Sanctions applying to the safety scheme established under the Rail Safety Act are contained in the Part 7 of the Transport Act 1983. The safety regulator for the rail system in Victoria including Trams is the Director, Transport Safety, whose office is established under the Transport Integration Act 2010. Rail operators in Victoria can also be the subject of no-blame investigations conducted by the Chief Investigator, Transport Safety. The Chief Investigator is charged by the Transport Integration Act with conducting investigations into rail safety matters including incidents and trends. Ticketing and conduct. Ticketing requirements for trams in Melbourne are mainly contained in the Transport Regulations 2006 and the Victorian Fares and Ticketing Manual. Rules about safe and fair conduct on trams in Melbourne are generally contained in the Transport Act 1983, and the Transport Regulations 2005. See also: List of tram and light rail transit systems, proposed Melbourne tram extensions, transport in Australia. References. Notes. Bibliography. External links. Official, Public Transport Victoria, Yarra Trams, 100 Years of Electric Trams in Melbourne, Melbourne Metropolitan Tramway Heritage Study, by Gary Vines 2011, Enthusiast, Vicziger Victorian Tramway Infrastructure and Rolling Stock Information, Friends of Hawthorn Tram Depot articles, Tramway Museum Society of Victoria Reflections, Melbourne's Trams to the Millennium, Trams of Australia, Geographically Accurate Map on Google Maps, Historical Map of Melbourne's Tramways showing horse cable and electric systems, A Social History of Melbourne's Trams on Culture Victoria.